And it is a kind of reflection on Ghazali's thought, which combines a little bit of his legal ideas with the implication of those ideas on the making of the political society in which he lived, in a way that focuses on the theoretical basis of his thought, slightly different from the traditional Orientalist approach of reading Islamic texts, more in line with a concern for a theological, theoretical basis, foundation of what Ghazali has to say. Those who are familiar with the texts of Imam Abu Hamid Al-Ghazali may remember that one of the prevailing styles in his writing is the drawing up of taxonomies. For example, he sets ways of categorizing diverse levels of religious piety in Kitab al-Ilm, the Book of Knowledge, which is part of his big magnum opus, Ihya Ulumuddin. He also assigns various groups of mankind to different tiers. He speaks of Awam, the common believers. He speaks of Khawas, the elite. And he speaks of Khas al-Khawas, the elite of the elite. Ghazali was not the first to make use of such divisions. There are people who wrote about that. However, many argued that this strategy gives Ghazali's text a deceptive feel of a tidy argument. For Ghazali, they remind us, is very difficult to categorize. Whilst he was an expert in Kalam, Kalam is abstract discursive theology in Islam, he criticized its uses among the Awam, the simple believers, and was critical of the theologians, the Mutakallimun, and their claims of knowledge. Also, whilst there are clear philosophical trends in his thinking, he speaks with a concern for what he calls kashf, unveiling, that is the fruit of God's own free gift of light and not of his own rational making. As a jurist, Ghazali speaks of fiqh, which normally is translated as jurisprudence, but he speaks of it as it relates to spirituality with a comprehensive vision that is not simply limited to the establishment of jurists. Whilst scholars have a fair number of reservations about Ghazali's overall tidy presentation, Ghazali's characterization of different categories of human beings is still suggestive of his concern to look for meaning beyond self-assertive religiosity. In the first book of the Ihya, Kitab al-Ilm that I've just mentioned, Ghazali returns to the early period, what he calls Al-Asr al-Awwal, for a definition of the word fiqh. Fiqh, as I said, is normally translated as law or jurisprudence. He says, fiqh applied to the science, and I'm using here a translation, to the sciences of the world to come, the knowledge of the shortcomings of the soul, the influences which render works corrupt, the thorough realization of the inferiority of this life, of the bliss of the world to come, and the domination of fear over the heart. That's Ghazali's view. He attacks the jurists and the scholars of his own day for their reductionist view of fiqh, which is limited to what he calls unusual legal cases. And then he goes on, the mastery of the minute details of their origins, and the excessive disputation of the same, and the retention of the different opinions relating to them. Therefore, he adds that fiqh and fahm, that is discernment and understanding, are but names for the same thing, a matter he bases on Quranic citations. In other words, he's saying that fiqh really means understanding. Though he still believes that fiqh includes legal opinion, he argues that as such, it remains a subdivision of the other broader meaning. He is still concerned with legal matters as they refer to the handling of social affairs, but has reservation if it is not evoked in its broader, you might call it sapiential, wisdom-oriented meaning that is concerned with regulating the purposes of human beings, which he calls in Arabic maqasid al-khalq. Jurists of his own day, he adds, were not concerned with the broader meaning as it does not provide a living. Surprise, surprise. Cannot help those who want a job in governorship or the judiciary or in attaining wealth and prestige. So according to this, if we were to categorize Ghazali in any particular type, he is, it seems, a medieval Muslim thinker who is concerned with, if I can use the biblical term, the spirit of wisdom and understanding. Discerning the broader purpose of divine will and law is what makes possible the attaining of the purposes of human beings. Therefore, the idea of law for Ghazali is what presupposes categories that regulate the world and give meaning to a purpose. But this presupposes a connection of divine nature, divine will, and human beings. That is, if one is able to discern divine will, reflecting the implications of some of the theological kalam debates on the relationship between divine will and nature and knowledge thereof. In other words, it presupposes a debate on Ash'ari doctrines of acquisition, what was called as kasb, occasionalism, and causality, which link human action with divine omnipotence for the purpose of affirming human obligation. I will not go into these debates here for lack of time, obviously, and there is a most recent contribution to that with the publication of Frank Griffin in his Al-Ghazali's Philosophical Theology. I will refer to main points for now. In the book of The Disciplining of the Soul, Riyad al-Nafs, Ghazali says, and I quote here the translation, "It is God who has disposed all matters through his arrangement thereof, who has equitably composed his creation and given it excellent form, who has adorned the aspect of man by granting him good stature and proportion, بِحُسْنِ تَقْوِيمِهِ وَتَقْدِيرِهِ, safeguarding him from increase and decline in his aspect measurements." This passage takes it for granted that everything exists because of the utterly free decision of God, which is what he said earlier in another work that he wrote called Al-Iqtisad fil-I'tiqad. There he pointed out that God does not only truly exists and truly knows, but also truly wills, carries the attribute of will, irada. Unlike human beings, who may be limited in materializing purposive actions, God is murid li-af'ali, he wills his actions. The act that comes from God is possible in its occurrence or non-occurrence. For though God's action is purposive and therefore law, it cannot be limited or conditioned. Ghazali underlined the point in his Iqtisad and confirmed it again in another work called the Maqsad al-Asna. There he says, "It will not do, like the philosophers, to think of the attributes of God as part of his essence. What God wills is not what he is. What he is remains unknown. But in order to maintain a level of consistency in speaking of God's activity, even if what makes God's action consistent is not available, he adds that both good and evil are ultimately willed by God. To say that this diminishes the divine goodness, as the Mu'tazila claim, is to misunderstand the point. God freely wills to act by his utterly unknowable nature." Ghazali here is at his most Ash'ari moment, as even Richard Frank confesses. Richard Frank is somebody who argued against the Ash'ari allegiance of Ghazali. Though the distinction between God's power to create and human power for action and will proves to be more complicated for Frank. Also, Eric Ormsby, another scholar who is now in London, has reminded us of Mu'tazilite elements in the way that Ghazali relates to God's will in creation, as he elaborates on how all things have been, I quote, "exquisitely positioned in the best possible arrangement in the world," end of quote. However, Ghazali's point remains that we should not be too bothered with why God wills to act in such and such a way. God's action is groundless and free. Ormsby quotes a passage from Kitab al-Arba'in, which reinforces this position, and I quote the passage. "God wills existing things and sets things created in time in order, for there occur in this world and in the transcendent world neither few nor many, small nor great, good nor evil, benefit nor harm, belief nor unbelief, recognition nor denial, gain nor loss, increase nor diminishment, obedience nor disobedience, except as a result of God's decree and predestination and wisdom and will. What he wishes is, what he does not wish is not." This is no new notion, Ormsby reminds us. It goes back to Plato's to Timaeus. John Finnis, a contemporary jurist who teaches today at Oxford, puts it this way: "No reason can be given or need be sought to explain why two identical individuals are distinct and different. No reason can or need be given for a choice that was really freely made as between two eligible alternatives. And no reason can or need be given why it is this world order rather than some other possible world order that exists." Ormsby's monograph on Ghazali's The Odyssey reflects what Renard called Ghazali's pastoral theology, showing how among medieval Islam's debaters over the primacy of divine will, Ghazali's acceptance of the world is the basis of trust, tawakkul, and growth in wisdom. Now this has implications on how and why we get to the knowledge of God's law. In a work called Faisal al-Tafriqa, Ghazali argues that human happiness lies in hearts which have been, I quote again, "refined through pure remembrance of God, nourished by right thinking and embellished with adherence to religious law, then drenched in the light that arcs from the niche of prophethood, at which time their hearts become, as if they were immaculate mirrors, the oil lamp of faith that rests in the enclosed glass around them, becoming a sort of light, its oil virtually glowing, though fire touches it not." In other words, in order to grow into what they're truly called to be, human beings are called to purify their soul, and as such to relate to the law as a purifying gift. The law here is important not simply as a legalistic affair, concerned only about doing the right thing in small details, though perhaps with some general devotion to God. According to this passage, the law is about the devotion of the heart to God, which, according to other passages in the Ihya, can only be shown in particulars. It is the making of one's life an offering to God, as it were. The law, being a gift, not simply an imposition, shows humanity's continuous need for guidance and growth towards God, towards a better humanity, as Al-Ghazali has it. It is what offers a possibility for the shaping of a life Godward. This free divine will, though an attribute of God and calls for the trust and obedience of human beings, does not necessarily mean a limit to God's omnipotence, qudra, as some of Ghazali's critics assumed. As if Ghazali is proposing to us something of God's own nature. Instead, with his pastoral emphasis, Ghazali gives an awareness of provisionality rather than a final definition of what is right or what is the right school of law in his big work, Ihya al-Din. Despite his Shafi'i leanings, Ghazali is known to have been a Shafi'i, he makes reference to all schools of law, the Madhahib, showing no partiality against any of them and warning against fanaticism, what he calls at-ta'assub bil-madhahib. So there is a capaciousness in Ghazali's text, and this capaciousness remains a natural corollary of his emphasis on the inexhaustibly different nature of God, what he calls tanzih. Ghazali quotes a tradition of Abu Bakr saying that, quote, God did not make a way for men to know him except through infirmity to attain knowledge of him. In this, he is in agreement, in fact, with the Eastern Church Fathers and their teaching on negative theology, and what the current Archbishop of Canterbury was about to move on calls the Augustinian tradition and its contemplative content. In other words, all we know about God is what God could never be. In this acknowledgement, Ghazali presents both a positive as well as a realistic approach to the purpose and meaning of being human. Positive inasmuch as God has adorned the aspect of man by granting him good stature and proportion, as I quoted earlier, and realistic inasmuch as God safeguards man from increase and decline in his aspect and measurements. This also means that the goal of an equilibrium that connects the finite human reality with the object that fulfills human flourishing is something that is progressively achieved. It is not achieved through a simplistic obedience to divine commands. Rather, one's will is guided toward those acts that make the person grow towards divine character traits. Attaining such wisdom is not an easy affair, he says. Such wisdom presupposes a content to divine life, that is God's law, which we struggle to acquire. At the same time, God's giving of the law, like God's action, is what God deems right to be shared. the response of human beings is to receive what is revealed for our happiness without attempting to explain why such a gift of the law is, as it were, the best possible arrangement. And this is not an episodic or determinate activity, which means it's not something that one chooses to agree with one day and another day choose to do something else. The assumption is, like for Augustine in the Christian tradition, human existence is inescapably temporal. Thus, human beings are at their best when they are learning beings, those who seek ilm, knowledge. And therefore knowledge is a virtue, it's a fadila, or an excellence, as another translator put it. Ghazali adds, and this is a quote translated, "The greatest achievement in the opinion of man is eternal happiness, and the most excellent thing is the way which leads to it. This happiness will never be attained except through knowledge and works are impossible without knowledge of how they are done. The basis of happiness in this world and the next is knowledge. Of all works it is therefore the most excellent." There's a scholar called Ibrahim Musa, who I think is at Duke University. He argued that Ghazali believed, I quote, that knowledge of the truth is contingent upon the conditions for knowing the truth. And indeed, in Tahafut al-Falasika, one of Ghazali's famous books, Ghazali says that there is a level of knowledge that is dependent on assimilating the intellect to the thing known by means of the intelligible objects. If it appears with a different face, its knowledge will have to be different. The same idea is alluded to in Kitab Ajaib al-Qalb. Like Thomas Aquinas, Ghazali acknowledges that insofar as rationality governs human action, there is a development in human knowledge. However, in the Ihya, the connections are not wholly explicit in the text, but there is indeed a line to be drawn to a pragmatic, contingently alert account of human growing and knowing. Ghazali makes sure that understanding the value of knowledge is not muddled. First, he says, whilst knowledge is a good thing, this doesn't mean that every item of knowledge is worth knowing, and that every discipline of learning is valuable. Second, while knowledge is a good thing, this does not mean that it is equally valuable for all in the same degree. And third, if knowledge is good, this doesn't mean that knowledge of one particular discipline is to be pursued by everybody at all times in all circumstances. Ghazali bewailed the presence of so many jurists in his society and the neglect of other mundane sciences in the society at the time, such as medicine. Fourth, in the Monk, which is his kind of autobiography, as it were, not quite, but similar, Ghazali confirms that his crisis, if you know his story, he had a moment of crisis in his own life where he deserted teaching and went looking for his own growth and spiritual development. He says, he confirms that his crisis marked a paradigm shift with regard to the purpose of knowledge. Because he says, at first, knowledge helped him attain his prestigious position in Baghdad. He was the prestigious professor at the Nizamiya College. Knowledge earned Ghazali status and prestige, which was, he says, my intent, كان ذلك قصدي ونيتي. However, by the time he was writing the Monqidh, he emphasized that to perceive knowledge was a gift divinely bestowed in the human disposition. And this, it seems, after his desertion of teaching in Baghdad, is the only explanation he offers of his own active search and commitment for knowledge. Therefore, good knowledge in the Ihya, in his biggest book, is that which is pursued for its own sake, as it is for the sake of God alone, or what he calls the wajhillah, rather than knowledge as useful in the pursuit of some other objective, such as jah, status, or power, which he now categorically condemns. As MacDonald, very eminent Orientalist, put it, God was unwilling that it should be for the sake of anything but himself. And this means that his interest in pursuing knowledge is not bounded only by the questions that aroused his desire to find out more. It is a gift. And in acknowledgement of that gift, it is for God's sake. Therefore, the act of pursuing knowledge is on one level self-evident, a given, which, though it cannot be demonstrated, needs no further demonstration. So the contingency of human learning, its dependence on variegated authority, for instance, different madhahibs, legal schools, the presence of a carefully modulated element of voluntarism within the whole scheme. Al-Ghazali, for example, explains in Kitab al-Mahabba how knowing and loving God cannot be understood without grasping that interest and affect are always at work in knowing subjects. So there's that level of voluntarism within the scheme. All this makes a trajectory out of Ghazali's ideas that might in the first place and in the contemporary discussions find affinity with those who stress the contingency of knowledge to matters of perspective, what we call today relativism. But on the other hand, Ghazali says more about knowledge of God. In line with his emphasis on tanzih, the utter difference of God, he would want to avoid misunderstanding God as a mere clear subject or object. The contingency of our knowing does not negate the otherness of the known object. At the same time, as the overarching reality of God is consistent, non-changing, it does not stand competing in space with our own observation. Rather, it casts light, as he says, on the intelligibility, rationality, and coherence of our intelligence. Therefore, if fiqh is about understanding, as I said at the very beginning of this lecture, then it is not about simply fulfilling a command, but it is encountered in what could be termed as discerning the law of things, the given ideas from which one derives assertion and axioms based on some basic principles that define the purpose and function of making judgment. So, Ghazali's encounter with the nature of God as law and wisdom cannot be separated from the interpretation of this. There is no easy separation of religious and secular knowledge in this method. For there are wide areas in which knowledge is in fact necessarily flexible, even when it purports to be knowledge of a non-historical reality. If the objects of our knowing are other, the idea of a finished identity between our conception and their reality is problematic. To know God involves an element of flexibility, not because of a relativist view that what is true of God changes according to circumstance, but because of the opposite conviction that God remains God, and for precisely that reason can only be discerned in the discerning of the divine action within the mutable world, in a process of learning, not a moment of transparent vision or simple submission to a decree. So what Ghazali wants to explore is how the pursuit of knowledge makes intelligible any particular instance of human work and activity. Pursuing knowledge is what provides the starting point for reasoning about what to do. So Ghazali does not dispense with reason's discriminatory power. At the same time, what the power of reasoning takes to be causal activity is what David Burrell, a former Tantur rector, calls customary connections established by the divine will. It is because of this that Ghazali refers to God as the sole legislator of the law. If God remains God, then what constitutes human beings, the kind of beings they are, does not change either. Thus, there are some things that simply hold for human beings as such, once you have granted the kind of universe that the ideas of law or wisdom entail. And if this is so, they hold for human society. That is to say, that some of what we know is matter of basic and non-negotiable procedure for being human before the Creator. And this takes us back to our initial point about fiqh. If fiqh is about understanding, then it is not about simply fulfilling a command, but it is encountered in what we called discerning the law of things, the given ideas, as I said earlier, from which one derives assertion, axioms, based on some basic principles. This is mirroring again what John Finnis, this Oxford jurist, called the analysis of practical reasonableness, as the principal concern for a theory of what he defines as natural law. What reason knows as basic and accepted as part of our creation, our khalq. For us now, concrete and historical subjects, not intellects in the abstract, the path to human happiness lies in following the law, which in turn assures the eternal continuance of the sense that it is a gift for our fulfillment within the limits of this mortal life. This law, at some level, is not something reason can work out for itself, for human reasoning is not pure, Ghazali reminds us. Revelation bears the ultimate legitimacy for human life. The quote in Arabic, he says, "Al-ulum al-aqliya kal-aghdiya wal-ulum al-shar'iyya kal-adwiya." In a book called Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, he said that acknowledging colours does not come with the power of the eye or the sun separately, but of both concurrently. And in this analogy, the eye stands for reason and the sun for revelation. So knowledge is about reason and revelation. And this is what he calls the noblest kind of sciences, Ashraf al-Ulum, that which combines reason with revelation. Reason, finite and limited as it is a participation in the reality of revelation as transmitted by the prophet when revelation is not reduced to the limited human imagination, but is the source that releases human imagination to constantly transform the self in the light of the same revelation. Thus, revealed law and wisdom has the same non-negotiable integrity as the basic structures of being in this world and being in society that are grasped by reason. To know how to be human, in other words, requires us to take very seriously the fact that we are historical beings. This means that we are never in a state of pure rationality and therefore never able, out of our own resources, successfully to negotiate the business of being properly human. Yet we learn from historical contingency how to limit the damage of our errors. Now here lies the foundation of Ghazali's political society, his vision for the political society. In discussing the purposes of creatures, maqasid al-khalq, as he says, and the most basic needs of humans, Ghazali arrives at an oblique discovery of nature's laws and the need for government, even though revelation, as you may remember, does not, that is the Quranic revelation or the prophetic tradition, does not specify the final shape and kind of government. Nature tells us something of the laws of society as he turns to nature's imperatives. So order in this world can only depend on basic prosaic factors that begin the foundation of society. In his context, farming for purposes of food, knitting for clothing, building for living, and he adds the word siyasa, which is normally translated as politics. But in defining politics, Ghazali does not mean the brokering of power or organs of government. Rather, it is discovering, as I try to explain all this way through, the law of things. The art of living socially, sharing a common life with shared purposes that also need to be controlled. In Arabic, I'll read it, he says, للتأليف والاجتماع والتعاون على أسباب المعيشة وضبطها. So politics is about the whole body politic that takes into account the need for cooperation among members of the society, and therefore the need to discover what is good and just. Now one can see something of Aquinas' understanding of servitas, and of course, in both cases, of Aristotle's perception of political science as aimed, I quote, at what is the highest of all good achievable by action. For man is a political creature, and one whose nature is to live with others. Therefore, the discussion for Ghazali moves to the purpose of that political body and its ultimate good. This world, he says, is the farm, the mazra'ah, of the next world. Aquinas will put it later like this. He says, the very existence of creatures is to be related to their creator. This world remains a means, an instrument, era, which connects with the next. So the political society is truly comprehensive when it is aware that there is no order for religion unless there is order in this world. La nizama lid-din illa bi nizam ad-dunya. And that this world can only be fulfilled if it grows towards what God has created it to be, the farm of the world to come. How are we on time?
Yeah, you've got about 15 minutes.
Good. Now, in his legal texts, so I'm moving slightly to a different sort of category here. In his legal texts, though Ghazali does not defend reasonable matters contradicted by revelation, he doesn't bother to prove matters essential or useful to life. They are simply self-evident. So when he discusses what he calls in the legal terms maslaha mursala, unrestricted public interest, that has not been regulated by the lawgiver, by God, in the absence of textual evidence, he bases the argument on the assertions of what he terms the aim of the law, maqsood al-shar. What are those? Protecting human life, preserving human mind, wealth, religion, and offspring. He gives different examples that reflect how human beings generally accept life as sacred, that procreation in itself is a good thing, that wealth or property is something all are entitled to, and that religion remains central and dependent on the order of the world. All of which means that certain actions or laws are deduced in order to preserve these basic assertions. Ghazali relates to those as roots, usul, of a certain form of qiyas, which are followed when action is considered to be an absolute necessity, darura qat'iyya, and universally effective, kulliyya, as it relates to the whole of the Muslim community. These basic, indispensable assertions are followed by a second list of necessities, hajiyat, which are not assertions simply for moral judgments, but for the proper ordering of the common good. Istighnaman, he calls it istighnaman lis-salah. A third level relates to what Ghazali calls tahsinat, improvements, which support the implementation of the law. So whilst, on the one hand, the givenness of revelation has the force of making human beings become closer to God, and as such has the same force as the law of nature, when it comes to legal and political institutions and conventions, we ought to ask what end they serve. This is when laws can be mutable. Once we understand what a law is for, we can understand whether and how it is mutable. Understanding what law is for means having some grasp of how historically limited systems work, of why such and such a law is thought to produce a particular effect in these circumstances, or why what once produced that effect no longer does so. In this way, a system can be more grounded in revelation than that of his historical disciplinarian opponents, the Kharijites or Ismaili Shiites. The assumption that the Quran is a book of positive law, which is the Kharijite assumption, in which we find specific directives for the society's ordering, requires us to ignore the whole question of the coherence of human nature and its goals, and the coherence of God's own being. Whilst God remains God and creation has its consistent character, created nature realizes its goals in contingent and temporal process, as I was explaining at the beginning. Thus, being faithful to that character and so to God's law, and so to God's being, involves being wary of any kind of positivism about laws enacted or even revealed in history, since to be bound to a set of historical positive enactments may lead us to be unfaithful to the real law of God, the wisdom in which we are created, when those enactments no longer effect a path to wisdom. Thus, true conformity to unchanging divine wisdom requires a flexibility in discipline and polity that is impossible for the positivist and the primitivist. Now, the modern reader, like us, will no doubt admire the skill and the visionary comprehensiveness of this argument. But there have been some questions raised by some scholars, most recently by Ibrahim Musa that I mentioned earlier, who relate to two questions. Both are to do with the undoubtedly odd fact that Ghazali presents what is in some ways a potentially radical apologetic in defense of a conservative and perhaps authoritarian position. So in the remainder of this lecture, I want to look at those two questions. That will not be too long. First, if Ghazali allowed for a variety of interpretations, why not allowing the same with regard to political authority and the definition of the imamate? And why not be tolerant of the philosopher's teachings on matters of doctrine? Two important questions. How would Ghazali meet the argument that the de facto order of caliph and sultan as the definitive form of government may require just the sort of adjustment in changed circumstances that he justified for methods of interpretation and legal ijtihad? Ghazali's support for the Imam to be a male descendant from Quraysh. Quraysh, if you don't know, is the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, would look to scholars like Ibrahim Musa like a step closer to the sanction of positive law, though his moral concerns would not allow positivism in his overall methods. Now, following my reading, however, Ghazali does not quite allow the argument to get to a full-fledged positive announcement on this matter. There are two things that stop his view of the imamate from getting there. First, he holds to his faith in the unknowable nature of God. And second, he holds to his position or opposition to the idea that the political leader is chosen by designation, by nas, which derive from unmediated prophetic mandate. What he instead starts with is a kind of basic self-structuring by the political community seeking to follow its common good, discovering the law of nature as it finds organs for executive power. He never claims that the order of the caliphate and the sultanate in his own context is the result of Quranic revelation as such. Yet, once decided upon and accepted by consensus, by ijma', it is law, divine law, even. Throughout his argument, Ghazali relates to the disciplining of the soul as the foundation of all this. He assumes that communities of reasoning beings have the duty to find an effective form of power for the restraint of vice and common coordination. Ghazali has no particular optimism about the ability of the masses for moral discernment, and argued for the need for legal and political authority in this regard, whilst the individual's reasoning or reasoning power does not depend on personal choice, but on that which is received and not invented. Now, Ghazali inherited a tradition, a political past, that witnessed divisions and argumentations about how to conserve the community's conformity to the law of God. This means that the community had to decide how to enact its aims. In the early period, one answer for that was that, to quote Wilfred Madilon, the Arabs will not recognize the rule of anyone but this tribe of Quraysh. Prompted by varied considerations about specific problems of the early community faces and the local difficulties it wants to relate to, it committed itself to this kind of polity, headed by an imam from Quraysh. Madilon, I just mentioned, has related to how this requirement has developed away from Quranic teachings, in fact, with regard to the obedience of Muslim masses, Arabs or non-Arabs, depending on political expediency at the time, and reflected its discursive separation of religious authority and political authority from early on. Once this commitment has been done, observing its consequences becomes a matter of law, even when there would have been full awareness for Ghazali of the contingency of this polity in its origin and the mutability of detail in its development, as he himself supports the addition of the Sultanate as part of what is sanctioned by law, when for his predecessors it would have been an innovation. But to pretend that this political order could be disposed of, as Musa suggests, is not only to be blind to one's own conditioning by that political history, but to ignore the ways in which Ghazali's historical context has become part of a wider reality of Muslims that still requires coordination and stability, ignoring the social concerns he had mentioned in his ethical texts, which he reflects when in the first section of the Nasiha al-Muluk, which is a treatise for advice to kings. He stands against absolutism, urging, and I quote him, that the ruler should not give satisfaction to any person if a contravention of God's law would be required to please him. In other words, the law for Ghazali remains above the ruler too. The ruler, again Ghazali says, should observe the same obedience as you would deem right that your servants observe towards you. And that in any matter between you and mankind, you should treat people in a way in which, if you were a subject and another were a sultan, you would deem tight or right that you yourself be treated. End of quote. Ghazali expands on the significance of justice in that text, and that should mark the authority of the ruler. Justice, Ghazali says, consists of restraining tyrannous instincts, passions, and anger in order to make them the prisoners of reason and religion, and of not letting reason become the prisoner of tyrannous instincts, passions, and anger. So this takes us to his ethical requirements on the realms of politics, which is to be discussed in another lecture. There is no doubt that Ghazali's practical stance against the Ismailis, for instance, carries a conservative sound for a modern observer. But the emphasis on the sanction of political positivism in this case reminds us that part of the polemical purpose of this stand was to secure a basis for legal action against dissidents who constituted a danger against the stability of the community. So my argument so far is stresses that Ghazali does not take the final step into absolutism of sovereignty, and he would not be comfortable with an authoritarian model of religious government. For as we mentioned earlier, the constant question of the accountability of polity to the human ends it serves cannot be avoided. Instead, what I've tried to ask is, what language does Ghazali propose in order to pose good political questions? That's the most important question of this lecture. What Ghazali's text reminds us of is the danger of change that is oblivious to what has formed the present of the community, Ignoring this, he would end up with either the Kharijite primitivism or the Mu'tazilite rationalism. Ghazali at least thinks how he came to pose questions like this, and how his questions and aspirations are continuous with his own history and the disciplining of the soul, as he calls it. Asking how the caliphal and sultanate authority came to be a compelling system of how to direct the Muslim society to a goal of happiness might be of more political interest than a simple dismissal of it. This is the last paragraph, or page, sorry. This applies also to his consistent stand against the philosopher's redefinition of doctrinal language, such as, if you're familiar with his critique of the philosophers, the eternity of the world, the resurrection of the body, and God's knowledge of the particulars. Frank Griffel, who teaches at Yale, echoing Ibrahim Musa, spoke of Ghazali referring to the right of political action to establish the rule of law against unbelief as a development from earlier meaning of kufr, which referred to the power of God alone to punish. But, again, if Ghazali truly opens up and submits, like in the Christian context of the modern world, Karl Barth does, to the claims of revelation, then here again what Ghazali stands for is received wisdom, the original positions of which Ghazali and the philosophers are wrong in reconstructing. The definitions of creation, of the soul, and of God are not something we make, as far as Ghazali is concerned, but they are revealed and given. It is not up to Ghazali or the philosophers to choose the final end of human beings, for human beings do not choose their nature either. Such is the effect of his qualified Ash'ari commitment in matters of theology. For in this there is always a prior reality of God, which takes priority to what we decide. The political history that Ghazali viewed is the means, the nazra as he calls it, to the ends that religious and doctrinal definitions articulate. Compromising these matters with the philosophers risks treating the end of human life as if under our own control. But his whole definition and concern with fiqh as wisdom and discernment would not stand if this were indeed the case. For it all hangs on God's own nature, in whose company and closeness Ghazali finds his bliss. Ghazali's stand, therefore, against the philosopher has a clear logic. For the basic doctrines of faith are about the end of man, and about things that are not negotiable to the same degree that religious jurisprudential activity cannot be vulnerable to political convenience either. In the oppressive and corrupt environment in which Ghazali lived, common good cannot be achieved within human power when this power cannot be guaranteed to be the fruit of reason and revelation together, as far as Ghazali was concerned. In this way, Ghazali's ethical teaching and his concern for the discipline of the soul tell us what we are for, and therefore this helps us to get to know a shape of life lived in accordance with the way things are, and how such a life is made possible even in the midst of corruptions and injustices, about which he constantly talks. It is no surprise that Ghazali is very hard to pigeonhole. What I aimed here to emphasize is his concern for wisdom that refused the positivism of the jurists of his own day, the rationalism of the philosophers and Mu'tazilites, though much of what they said he incorporates in his language, showing how his critique in matters of law and politics is analogous with that of his stand against the philosophers and the Batinites, the Ismailis. Thank you for listening.